This is an opportune moment to say that this is the first in a new series, so we're still with the teething issues, but we're delighted to be kicking the series off again, and I'm particularly delighted to be seeing this paper and for this session. So we're going to run for about 45 minutes from Dana Foarta, who's going to be presenting for us. We'll then have a formal discussion from Luigi, and then there'll be a little bit of time to chat. And how you want to run it during the, I know Takao, who's a co-author on the paper, is here and will be paying attention to what's going on in the chat. If there's things to raise to Dan as we go, then probably doing it in the chat, which I'll keep an eye on in the first instance, is fine. Or if it's burning, then Dan, I'm sure you're okay with people kind of unmuting and letting themselves be heard. So without further ado, take it away.
All right, thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. It is a pleasure to kickstart the Virtual IO Seminar series. Let me go into full screen mode here. With this joint project with Steve Callender and Taco Sugaya, my colleagues at Stanford, and as Hesky mentioned, Taco is here to handle the chat if there's questions you would like to type in there. And this is a project whose broad motivation starts from noting that markets and politics are deeply intertwined, that politicians set the rules for market competition, which determines the profits that firms can make in the market. And then these profits are wielded back into politics through campaign contributions, lobbying, and other influence activities. This implies, therefore, a circularity between what happens in the markets and what happens in politics. Outcomes in both domains are co-determined, and their relationship is evolving over time. We want to understand what this circularity implies for outcomes. How do money and influence in politics distort market outcomes? This is also very much related to the big debates that we're having now regarding market concentration. In particular, evidence shows that market concentration has increased in the US, and that has corresponded to an increased market share for the largest firms. Now, the IO literature and the macro literature are still looking at what is the link between this concentration and markups. However, what we're going to be looking at in this paper is just the issue of concentration and the largest market share for the largest firms. And when we think about concentration, there are two potential ways in which it can affect efficiency. It can be good for efficiency if concentration is the result of the largest firms in the market becoming better at producing what they're producing. So if they're becoming more efficient, then this is just a representation of them gaining more market share through their investments in technology. Whereas the effects of concentration on efficiency could be negative if what these largest firms are doing is using their power to set up barriers to competitors through the political process. And this would be the kind of bad concentration that comes from political influence. What we propose in this paper is a theoretical structure to inform these debates, and particularly a model that combines political economy with market structure. What we show is that there is a positive feedback loop between firms that invest in technology and firms that invest in politically based means of kicking out competitors. And this feedback loop, however, is limited in that once a firm invests sufficiently in technology so it becomes more efficient in the market, its need for regulatory barriers that keep competitors out is reduced. And so in a world in which politicians are strategic and rational, these politicians understand that they need to remain relevant. And in order to do so, there needs to be a sufficient competitive threat for firms to value lobbying and other politically based entry barriers that they can extract. And so the desire of policymakers to manage competition is going to lead, however, to bad outcomes. We're going to have in equilibrium high market concentration, so monopoly in our model, and low investment, and so technology stagnation. And what we show is that the degree to which we get this political inefficiency depends on the structure of market competition itself, because the leverage that policymakers have is a function of the structure of market competition itself. In particular, lower competitive pressure reduces the political inefficiency by reducing the need and the demand for political barriers. And sometimes this may even outweigh the economic efficiency loss of less competitive pressure, leading to sometimes better outcomes. In terms of related literature, this is a paper where we are combining a theoretical model of political economy, of a self-interested policymaker, with a model of competition in the market. And there have been few papers in political economy that have looked at this from a theoretical perspective outside of the world in which the government itself is an owner of firms in the market, so outside of expropriation or public ownership. Of course, there has been a lot more empirical work recently that has highlighted the positive shares of firms and lobbying contributions, as well as the increased use of political connections by firms as they grow. In the IO side, there's a very large literature that studies optimal antitrust and competition regulation, but the IO literature generally doesn't consider the politics side of the policymaker enforcement, and particularly they don't look at self-interested politicians. And similarly, for the large literature on competition decisions by firms. That is, of course, not to say that we are the first ones to recognize the relationship between markets and politics. This goes back to Stigler and has been more recently discussed by Luigi in his recent work. So with that, let me jump into and what we're doing here. We have a market where we have two firms that compete on quantities. And we have an infinite horizon, discrete time environment. And of each firm that produces, each of the two firms, has a technology that determines its marginal cost of production. We call the firm with the higher level of technology the leader in technology, and we call the firm with the lower level of technology the follower. And we denote the technology level of the leader by L and the technology level of the follower by F. Now, given Cournot competition and these marginal costs that are a function of technologies, we can solve for the profits that the firms make in the market. And we have two objects of interest in this model that we take as our primitives, which are the profits that the firms make from competing. The profit for the leader we denote by pi L, and the profit for the follower by pi F. And we make a couple of regularity assumptions. So first, the profit of the leader is going to increase in the leader's own technology, which decreases its marginal cost. And it's going to be decreasing in the follower's technology. Also, we assume that the leader's profit is concave in its own technology, it's convex in the competitor's technology, and that the marginal gain in profit from increasing technology is decreasing in the follower's technology. We show in the paper that we can obtain all of these properties set of parameters. Now, In this setup, the firms can invest in technology and gain what we call capability-based rents. They lower their marginal cost by investing in technology, and that, of course, gives them higher profits. The leader can invest in technology at a cost C of L that is increasing and convex. And once this investment cost is paid, the leader moves up one step deterministically. So the technology level for the leader goes from L to L plus 1. The follower may also move in at zero cost on the condition that it operates in the market in that period. This is motivated by the fact that, for one, we should have lower cost of moving up in technology for a follower compared to a leader who pushes the technology frontier. And we make here the extreme assumption that there's zero cost for the follower. And also that there is a learning by doing component to technology movements that require, therefore, that the firm operates in the market for it to move up in technology. So this is the market setup. Now, the political side is that we have this policymaker who can impose a minimum standard, a regulatory barrier, that we take as a floor on technology. That is, only firms at or above the technology standard can operate in the market. And therefore, whenever this standard is binding, what we have is a situation where only the leader, the firm with the higher technology, is going to satisfy the standard, whereas the follower will not. And when this happens, we say that the leader obtains political protection. And when it obtains political protection, it becomes a monopoly. So it gets the highest market share of one, and it derives profit by hat of M, the monopoly profit. Where here, we make the regularity assumption that this profit is increasing in own technology and concave in own technology. Now, these politically based rents that are obtained from political protection are obtained in exchange for lobbying for this protection. And that is by paying rents to the policymaker. And we assume a rent sharing agreement between the policymaker and the leading firm, by which the policymaker obtains a share row of the value of the policy that is being provided. So that is the difference between if it were competing in the market with the follower. And row captures in reduced form kind of the power of the policymaker to extract rents. Importantly, we assume this rent-seeking process that links directly to the value of the regulatory barrier itself. And once these rents are paid, our monopolist therefore becomes a protected monopolist. So a firm whose rents are the difference between monopoly profit minus what is being paid to the policymaker through lobbying. Importantly, we don't allow in this model commitment or contracting. The firms themselves cannot borrow from the future to pay rents today, and the policymaker cannot commit to policy beyond, it cannot commit to policy in the future. So there's therefore all of this agreement of rent sharing is done on the value of policy today only. So the timing of the model is as follows. As long as we have these two firms that are differentiated, so L is strictly greater than F, at the beginning of each period, the leading firm decides whether to invest in technology or not. And if it invests in technology, deterministically it moves up. Then the policymaker decides whether to set the binding standard or not. Afterwards, the market opens and we have competition if there's no political protection, or monopoly if there is political protection. And production happens given marginal costs determined by technology L plus I for the leader and F for the follower. After the market closes, we have a transition in which the follower, if it has competed in the market, moves up one step, and therefore will start tomorrow's period with F plus 1 as their technology. And otherwise, the follower doesn't move if they were out of the market. And this is a crucial element of the model, because the follower not being able to move unless it is operating in the market and learning by doing imposes an important cost on the policymaker when the policymaker decides whether to impose this binding standard or not, because the rents of the policymaker are increasing in it. And to make a kind of a parenthetical comment, if the firms are at any point equal in technology, we just assume nature picks one firm to move ahead and invest, and then the game is played according to this time. Okay, so in terms of objectives, we have a policymaker who is long-lived, forward-looking, discounts the future at rate delta, and it maximizes the discounted value of rents by choosing whether to impose the technology standard each period or to not impose it. And of course, it gets rents only if it imposes the standard. So it just maximizes the discounted value of rents given the decision to impose the standard. We also assume that firms in this model that I'll present today are going to be myopic, or they're going to discount the future at rate 0. In the paper, we also show what happens if firms are forward-looking and discount the future at some positive rate. And we show how the qualitative insights, main insights, continue to hold even with firms that are forward-looking. And firms also maximize the discounted value of profits. Again, what I'll present today is just profits each period. All right, so for the equilibrium, we identify a renegotiation proof, subgame perfect equilibrium. We prove that this is unique and that it is also a Markov perfect equilibrium. And so we will show how we will solve for it through backwards induction. Before I jump into solving for the model, there's two main assumptions that we make in this setup. The first assumption is that the marginal or the gain in profit from moving up one technology step is smaller in the case of a monopolist than it is in the case of a leader in competition. This is kind of a similar assumption to the arrow replacement effect, whereas Arrow looked at innovation and said that a monopolist is going to be less willing to innovate compared to a firm in competition because the monopolist cannibalizes on its own product if it innovates. Here we make a similar assumption on this technology investment of firms that affects their production cost. And we assume that improvements in technology are going to be more valuable to the firm in competition because essentially the increase in market share that this firm in competition can achieve through investment in technology dominates the benefit that you get just from reducing the cost of producing each unit. Now, if you look at this assumption and you move the terms that are L+1 to the left side of the equation and the terms with L to the right side of the equation, or the inequality, you see that we actually obtain the result that the value of the regulatory barrier, the difference between monopoly profit at some technology level L and the profit of the leading firm in competition at technology level L is decreasing in L. So that is to say that the rents to the policymaker, which are a fraction of this value of the regulatory barrier, are going to be decreasing in L under this assumption one. The second assumption that we're making is that technology investments each period yield this one-step move in technology that is small, in the sense that the profit of a protected monopolist at technology level L is higher than the profit made by a leader in competition at technology level L+1 minus the cost of making the investment. That is to say that investing and losing political protection is going to be less preferable to the firm than not investing and having political protection. Or in other words, the jump in technology is not so high so as to outweigh the value of political protection for the firm. Okay, so under these two assumptions, I will proceed to solving for the model. And let me start with the benchmark in which we don't have a political decision maker that is strategic. So assume the case in which this policymaker is there, it takes rents, but it always gives the regulatory barrier and it always eats the rents every period. So there's guaranteed monopoly every period and the firm is a protected monopoly every period. In this case, everything that happens in this model is just that the firm has to decide, the protected monopolist has to decide every period whether to invest or not. So the protected monopolist, therefore, will invest in technology as long as the rents from doing so, so the difference between the protected monopolist's profit at the L+1 value of technology minus the cost of investing is higher than the rents from not doing so, so the profit of staying at L. And we show that this inequality holds as long as F is sufficiently small, or as long as F is below a threshold that we denote by ICM of L, where this threshold is decreasing in L. The reason for that is that we have a protected monopolist who pays rents to the policymaker. And these rents are increasing in F. So the higher the F, the more of the profit goes towards rents. And so investing and increasing profits gives less of the remaining rents to the firm compared to how much goes to the policymaker as F is higher. Moreover, we have an increase in convex cost of investment, which means that as L increases, the point at which you want to stop is coming faster. Now, we can represent this in a two-dimensional graph where we have on the x-axis the leader's technology level, L, and on the y-axis the follower's technology level, F. And so anything that happens in this model is going to happen below the 45-degree line where L is equal to F, or at the 45-degree line. And so any point here is a potential state of the world. And in this benchmark, assuming we start from the state of the world where both firms are at technology level 0, we have a guaranteed monopoly who will invest as long as F is going to be below the threshold, ICM, at which point the protected monopolist will stop investing. So we're going to have a transitional path where the protected monopolist kind of moves up in technology one step at a time. And then when the red dot is reached, that's where the investment stops and we're in a steady state with monopoly forever and rents being paid to the policymaker forever. So now, given this benchmark, what's going to happen when we have the strategic policymaker? This is essentially what we add to this problem, the idea that the policymaker themselves are rational and strategic. And so what I'm going to show you that what happens in that case is that starting at the origin, the long-run steady state is going to be at some L star 0, where L star is a lower technology level than what we had in the benchmark with guaranteed monopoly. And on the transitional path, starting from 0, 0, we have we have monopoly that invests, and then in the steady state, once L star is reached, investment stops, and the monopolist is protected forever. So we have the same steady state with protected monopoly, but at a lower technology level than in the benchmark. And in fact, we get this inefficiency both on the transitional path, because we never get competition on the transitional path, and also this lower investment in the steady state. And particularly, sorry, the lower investment level at which we have the steady state, where of course there's no longer any investment. So why do we get this worse situation than in the benchmark? We get that because now the policymaker, being strategic, understands that there is a cost to putting this regulatory barrier in. Every time the barrier is in, the follower is outside of the market and cannot advance in technology. And so the gap between leader and follower increases. This means that the value of future regulatory barriers is decreasing as the gap between firms becomes larger. And so every time the regulatory barrier is put in, it comes at a cost of a lower stream of rents in the future. And this generates an incentive compatibility constraint for the policymaker, where the policymaker finds it preferable to put in a regulatory barrier today, as long as the gap between firms is not too large. Whereas once the gap between firms is large, the marginal benefit of having the follower enter the market and move up technologically is higher, is sufficiently high so as to make not taking rents today preferable. So we're going to be in a situation where political protection is going to be offered above this policymaker threshold represented here by the increasing blue line. And below this, once the gap between firms is large, there is no political protection being offered. And so the policymaker forgoes rents today in order to increase the stream of future rents. So now, given an incentive compatibility constraint of this type for the policymaker, will show that indeed, alongside this this constraint, the leading firm is not going to invest. And in particular, consider starting from any technology state that is just above the investment threshold for the monopolist and just above the threshold for political protection being offered by the policymaker, what we denote here by LF+1. Once the state is reached, we are going to be in a steady state because the state is above the point at which even a protected monopolist with guarantee monopoly would stop investing because of the cost of investing becoming too high. And we're above the threshold for the policymaker, so at a point at which political protection is offered. So this is going to be a steady state with no investment and protection. To reach the steady state, we're going to have to reach it by moving from the state just below it, which is LF. At this state just below it, we are just below the policymaker's threshold and just below the monopolist's investment threshold. Being just below the policymaker's threshold means that no political protection is offered here. The follower competes and will move from F to F+1 next period. So this is going to be a state that exists where we are for one period, and then we're going to move to the steady state. So now how do we reach LF? Well, we reach LF from L-1F. And what happens at L-1F? At this point, the leading firm has to decide whether to invest or not in technology. In order to reach LF, it has to invest from L-1. But now the problem is that once it invests and moves to L, it moves to the point where it is competing against the follower because there's no political protection. If it chooses not to invest and to stay at this state, it is above the policymaker's threshold, and it is therefore receiving political protection. So at this point, at L-1F, it gets the protected monopoly profits, whereas at LF, it gets the duopoly profit of the leader, and it pays the cost of investment. So by assumption two of the step in technology being small, we know that the value of political protection is higher than the gain from moving this one small technology step. And so the leader is not going to want to make this investment. And so it's going to be a steady state here where the leader decides not to invest and take the political protection rather than investing and having to compete. And this decision to withhold investment because of the fact that investment would lead to competition is what we call the reverse arrow effect here. That is to say, our standard arrow effect tells us that you want to invest more to escape competition, to gain more market share from your competitor. Well, here we have a situation where investing actually makes you lose political protection. It makes you therefore go from a market share compete in a duopoly against the follower. And so that losing protection, the problem of losing political protection makes the firm stop investing. And now what happens with once we have this insight that the firm will stop investing before it crosses into competition? Well, this allows us then to solve the equilibrium by backward inducting. So what happens at the state that is just below the state that we were discussing earlier, the L-1F state, at the state L-1F-1? Well, if the state is just below the policymaker's constraint, then there's going to be competition here. We're going to move, and the follower will move. So we're going to move from this state to the steady state that we just discussed. In order to reach this blue state, therefore, we go back one step in L, and we have the exact same problem if that state is to the left of the policymaker's threshold. And therefore, investment is going to not be done at this state either. This is going to be a steady state as well. And so we can backward induct all the way down to the x-axis, and our steady state is therefore going to be this L star that is just just before the policymaker's threshold. And the idea here, or the main kind of message going back to the word I used in the introduction, is that this desire of the policymaker to manage competition, by which we mean to keep the gap between firms sufficiently small, is going to result in the leader's decision to withhold investment, creating this reverse arrow effect where investment stops earlier than it did in our benchmark. And it is therefore this interaction between the strategic policymaker and the leading firm that leads to this worse effect than we had in the benchmark without the strategic policymaker. And now, importantly, what this whole mechanism is based on is the fact that the policymaker here has leverage. The leverage is that this follower firm is dormant outside of the market and ready to be active whenever the policymaker lifts the entry barrier. And this is, of course, a strong assumption, given that in equilibrium, this follower never enters, so not on the transitional path and not in the steady state. And so what happens if we lower this leverage? We do this by assuming that the firm is not going to stay dormant forever. And in fact, the firm will die if it does not compete in the market for some number of periods, let's say K periods. And so now we have to keep track of not only the technology level of the firms, but also how many periods has there been that the firm hasn't been, the follower firm hasn't been in the market. And of course, we assume that the policymaker values rents in the future sufficiently so that they want to keep this firm alive and to extract rents in the future as well. Once we have this weakening of the competitive pressure and therefore weakening of the policymakers' leverage, we get better outcomes. In the steady state, we still get monopoly, but without rents being paid to the policymaker. But we get two sources of efficiency. One is that technology can be higher than under monopoly or duopoly in the steady state. And second, that we're going to get competition on the transitional path. Or not in all states, of course, but in some states along the transitional path. And the key drivers of this, these two sources of efficiency are that on the one hand, the reverse arrow effect will be overcome in some periods. And second, that we're going to get a new effect, which we'll call the enhanced arrow effect, that encourages more investment than before. So first, why the no reverse arrow effect? Well, this is going to come because every K periods, the firm has to be, the follower firm has to be let into the market, else it dies. So if the policymaker in that K period takes rents and sets the entry barrier, then the follower exits permanently and future rents are zero. If the policymaker values future rents sufficiently, she wants these rents to be positive, so she lets the follower in today and forgoes rents today in order to keep this stream of future rents coming. But that means that the decision to let the follower in is independent of the investment decision of the leader. Whether the leader invests or not this period, it's not going to change the policymaker's decision on whether to open the market or not. And so there is this, there's no reverse arrow effect in this case anymore. The leading firm is going to make its investment decision if it's cost effective to do so, and it knows it has to compete regardless of whether it invests or not. And that's going to encourage investment as well as we're going to obtain some competition along the equilibrium path. The second outcome, the second better outcome is that we get higher technology. So why is that, or higher technology investment? Why is that? Well, first notice that there's going to be some point at which the leader catches up with the follower, or sorry, the follower catches up with the leader. And that is because by design, the cost of investing, C of L, is increasing. So at some point, the cost of investing is high enough that this threshold ICM is reached. The firm would not want to invest under any circumstances because it's too expensive. Whereas the follower is let in every number of periods. So eventually, after enough times that the follower has entered the market, the follower will catch up to the leader. With the leader that has stopped investing. So we're going to end up on this 45-degree line where the leader and the follower are at the same technology level. And at that point, the policymaker's leverage goes to zero because there is no technology standard that can separate two equal firms. And this is leading us to a better outcome because once a firm then invests off the 45-degree line, so moves one step ahead of the other, then the entry barrier can be offered again by the policymaker. So now we have a situation where the firms are competing in Cornell, and once one firm invests, then that firm becomes a protected monopoly. So the incentive to invest is higher than the standard arrow, which is just grabbing a bit of market share from the competitor by increasing technology. Here, the firm is grabbing the whole market by increasing technology. And that's what we call this enhanced arrow effect. And this is going to lead to better outcomes because it's going to lead to some more of this investment off the 45-degree line. And then after K periods, the follower will be let back in, and so on, until the point is reached at which the firm no longer wants to invest off the 45-degree line. And in fact, we show that, well, the policymaker that is strategic and self-interested will never actually let the system go back to the 45-degree line past the point at which the firm, any firm would want to invest. In particular, once the policymaker is just shy of the point at which the firms would not want to invest off the 45-degree line, and it faces the Kth period in which it has to let the follower in, the policymaker will not let the follower in, will take rents that period and let the follower die. Because if she were to let the follower in, she would get 0 rents today, and then the firms would be neck and neck on the 45-degree line forever, past the point at which any one of them wants to invest due to the cost of it, and rents would be 0 forever. So it is better for the policymaker to just take rents today with the understanding that that's the last period that rents are possible in. And so in the steady state, we're still going to have monopoly, but a monopolist that is now unencumbered by any threat of competition. The better outcome is going to be that this steady state is going to occur at a higher level of technology than we've had in our benchmark, or of course in our proposition 1. Now, the fact that the steady state has a monopolist that doesn't pay any rents anymore doesn't mean that rents weren't paid along the transitional path, or in the words of money in politics, it doesn't mean that money in politics and lobbying wasn't important in order to reach the steady state. In particular, that government protection wasn't important to lock in the advantage of the leader as we transition towards the steady state.
Think about wrapping up, Dana.
Yes, so I'm going to wrap up with one more minute, which is to say that an important difference we wanted to highlight with this is how much the policymakers' leverage depends on the structure of markets, in particular on the competitive pressure that is in the markets. And our 2 cases show how this can lead to very different outcomes in terms of technology states of the market in the steady state. And also concluding here with policy implications and how we link this to the issue of antitrust, what we wanted to highlight with this is that once we take into account strategic policymakers, it brings a cautionary note to thinking about optimal antitrust policy, in that you have to think also about the incentives of the enforcer and how these incentives of the enforcer are going to change outcomes or are going to distort the predicted outcomes coming from just optimal policy analysis. And that's it. And thank you very much. I'm going to leave the conclusion slides up, but I'm going to end on time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So our discussant is Luigi Zingales, and I'll let you take it away, Luigi.
Okay, can you see my slides?
Yeah, perfect.
Perfect. So thank you very much for inviting. This is a very interesting and exciting paper. And the motivation is very simple. There is a great attention today to an increase in market power in the US economy. And even a couple of books have been written about this. There is equally some attention, even if maybe less so, to an increase in the political power of firms. And the question that this paper really addresses is how the two interact. And honestly, there is a much less attention on the interaction between the two. I think this is a very important point, so much so that in a JEP article, I talk about the risk of what I call a Medici vicious circle. Why Medici? Is because the Florentine family made its money with banking, but then really used that money to conquer political power. And after that, they remain in power for a long time and rich for a long time because they were buying themselves protection. And so money gets power and power gets money, and you get stuck in this situation. So I will skip the description of the model because I think Dana did a great job there. And let me focus on some general comments. So the model is simple and elegant. However, there are some assumptions that are not innocuous. There is a lot of robustness analysis of some assumption, much less on others that I consider quite important. So first of all, how the political power interferes. So my understanding is that the reverse hour effect and the political enhanced hour effect, which are really nice and are very well described in the paper, is by and large by assumption. In a sense, you're saying that in order for a politician to protect you, you must have a technology which is a little bit ahead of everybody else, which is possible, but I can present example of the opposite. And also, the reverse hour effect really depends on the way you specify the technology of intervention and so on. So I think that there's nothing bad in making that by assumption. What I would like to have seen is more example that we're not modeling an empty set. I'm sure there are examples, and I will come back to that, but I think I will have presented a little bit earlier. The second is, this is a funny model because in most models I've seen, you see that firms are very farsighted and politicians are myopic. This is a model in which politicians are farsighted and firms are myopic. Now, of course, there is a generalization in which firms are not myopic, but what I find it pretty startling is that there is this very farsighted political power. Now, depending on the regime, depending on the probability of being reelected, etc., I imagine that politicians don't have that long horizon. And if you were to change, the dynamic of the model will change quite a bit. I don't see this necessarily as a liability because I think that could provide some interesting comparative statics of where do you expect different dynamics depending on the political structure of a country. And then there is a funny assumption that I'm not so sure I fully appreciate the importance, but my gut feeling is that it is problematic. And this is what I call the end of history in technology, that there is a maximum investment in technology. And when you reach that, you stop investing. Now, this is probably to simplify the analysis. However, it's really crucial because the equilibrium is inferred by backward induction on that ending point. And I think that once you consider the possibility of further innovation, I'm not so sure that the dynamic is so robust. So I would like to see a bit more discussion on that. Now, as I said earlier, for most of the paper, I was desperately looking for an example. Now, the example finally came, and it's pretty interesting. Dana did not have time to discuss it, but it's the history of a regulation in telecommunication, and particularly what they say is that the 1913 Kingsbury Commitment is really a way to provide a monopoly for AT&T, and which at the time had a technological lead. But as a result of that monopoly, AT&T really underinvested in the network. So that will fit the model very nicely. And then when the cell phone opportunity came about, AT&T started to invest in order to have the best network and trying to lobby to have the monopoly in the cell phone, but it was quote unquote compensated with the introduction of competition, which is consistent with the model. What I would like to see more is why that took place from a political economy point of view, because I don't see that in the paper and I don't know the history maybe well enough. Now, I like the implication that a firm initially invests in technology to increase capability, but then lobby basically induce a shutdown in investments, and they cite a paper by Akijit that documents that. Now, this does not happen all the time, and so it would be interesting that the paper had something to say when it happened, when it doesn't. And the model shows that there might be little money in politics. That's what she described also in the paper. I think that is this true in practice that very old industry tend to lobby less? I am not so sure. I think there's something to be discussed. Dana also mentioned an antitrust implication, which is mentioned in the paper. I don't think is elaborated in the paper as much as I would like, because the idea is that you want to consider the long-term political effect of antitrust, not just the market effect. This is something that is very dear to me, because in my book 10 years ago, I argued that you should consider this aspect. In particular, my concern is that once you have a monopoly, it's much easier to capture a regulator than when you don't. When you have a higher concentrator in the market, it's easy to capture the regulator, and that is something that is not really the driving force in this model, but is somewhat related. And speaking of, in my 2017 piece, I have I don't have a model, but I have a discussion about the interaction between market power and political power. So last night I was trying to compare what is in this paper, what is not in this paper. My two key ingredients is that one, the ability to influence the political power increase in this market power. And this is because I think of a more sophisticated model of capturing that doesn't work through bribes, but work through, for example, revolving doors. And the credibility of this increases with market power. Here, they have a very simple model of political economy. It's just basically ability to pay that drives the force. Then the other force I have is the need to influence the political power increase with market power. So for two reasons. One is the higher the rent, the stronger the incentives to basically create some barrier to entry, but also the higher the rent, the higher the risk of political expropriation. Now, this is somewhat similar to what they have. They use the fact that you can only protect a superior technology. So one extension I will recommend is to consider an international competition, because in this modern world, rarely a regulator controls all the potential competitors. So the game is actually much more, if you want, interesting, where you have a policymaker that can restrict entry in the local market, but not foreign competition. And so the policymakers might care about the profits of a national champion, but also might care a little bit about the consumer surplus. And so I think that the dynamic is clearly a different paper, but I think would be very interesting. What I think might belong to this paper is an analysis of how the discount rate of the policymaker is related, for example, to the political regime or the political system terms limit, and how this might affect the dynamic of this interaction between the policy side, the political side, and the market side. So concluding, I think is a good first attempt of this interaction. I think is more an IO model of the interaction between market structure and political economy, rather than a political economy model of interaction, because it's very rich on the IO side. It lacks riches on the political economy side. And I find the results a little bit too much dependent on the key assumption that needs to be validated as relevant in practice. But this said, I think it's a great paper, and I strongly recommend everybody to read it.
Thank you very much, Luigi. So we're running a little bit over time, but there certainly is time for further comments and questions. There's a few things in the chat.
Let me, Heskey, I'm going to have to leave in a few minutes,
yeah.
So let me just jump in quickly. One of the things, and I think it goes both to the paper, and it felt like it was in the background on Luigi, in this kind of context, I think of Gilbert and Newberry, that it's in the interest of the leader to invest in the bribery or the campaign contribution for the political protection, that not going to be in the interest of the follower to try to lobby as well, because the follower can only hope for duopoly profits, the leader for, so that doesn't undercut, and if anything, it supports your results, but it may be worth just putting in there so that somebody like me doesn't say, but what about Gilbert and Newberry?
Thank you very much. And thank you, Luigi, for the comments. I know we're short on time, so I can defer responding over email instead.
Or feel free to respond. Maybe that'll.
Yeah, no, I would say thank you so much for the comments. I think they really captured both the problems that we were having when we were thinking about how to model these issues, as well as things that I completely agree that are important extensions or things that new papers need to address, like political competition and more of the political side of this equation. On the first issue about the assumptions and how much they drive the arrow effect, the reverse arrow effect and the enhanced one, it does reflect something that we've also been kind of thinking of when we are modeling this, which is how do we create a tool for the politician that is not absolutist in the sense of expropriating firms, but also not too weak that the political protection is not valuable or is superseded by just investments in the market. And so assumption 2 was kind of creating a sufficiently strong political protection value by not having the investment in technology essentially jump over any value of political protection. Whereas the idea of this kind of having to separate the firms or having to have one firm ahead of the other in order for the regulatory barrier to act, that was also coming from wanting to weaken the tool of the politician and have a politician who cannot just pick winners by the identity of the firm, but rather through some sort of market characteristics. So clearly there's many ways in which you could have done this, but it definitely kind of, that was our thinking in putting these constraints on the problem.
So we're at time, and I think my main job is to keep it. So let me thank very much Dan and Luigi. This was a great start to the series. I'm going to stop the recording at this stage, but I'd like to ask